The Movie Preview Critic. Informing and entertaining your movie world.
And so, Platinum Dunes continues to rape the movie dead, engaging in cinematic necrophilia, wringing movie character corpses like damp towels for every last drop of value that might be hiding in the creases of their decomposing movie flesh. Here's a list of horror remakes Platinum Dunes has produced. As you can see, as a company, Platinum Dunes is basically focused on remaking horror movies. They do have a few non-remake, non-horror projects, but those are rare. This company is all about snatching up the rights to all the old profitable 70s and 80s horror franchises and remaking them cheaply for big, easy profits. I just want to go on record by saying there's nothing wrong with remaking old movies. If they were good ideas that were just done poorly, or if their message is still relevant in today's society and we need to be reminded of this wisdom. For example, there was The Blob in 1958, and then there was The Blob in 1988. And I think the 88 version is way better. The original had a great idea, but lacked the special effects to truly realize the idea to its full potential. The 88 version also added some attitude, gored it up a bit, and added a lot of action. A nice update of an old idea. There are plenty of great movies that are remakes, but there are more bad ones than good ones. The problem is when movies that were done well the first time and still hold up today are remade. Then, those remakes feel forced and inauthentic. Usually when a story's created, it's born because of something that's in the air. Cultural perspiration that builds until an artist hears it, feels it, and listens to it, and creates something, giving it form and life. There's something true in this moment, when an original idea is given form. If this art is a success, that means we the audience feel that it has some truth. We connect with it and reward it for putting into form something we already knew, but couldn't communicate ourselves. If it's done well, it holds up no matter the time frame. For movies, look at Wizard of Oz, The Godfather, and Star Wars. Those never need to be remade because they did it right and best the first time around. The message they shared and the culture they defined still exists within them, and all each new generation needs to do is go back and watch them to learn the lessons and experience the emotions of times past, which are still relevant in times today. So only if the filmmakers of the original missed something important that needed to be explored and shared, should a movie be remade. So let's ask, why is Friday the 13th being redone? Well, let's ask why it was made in the first place almost 30 years ago. For that, we must travel back to the movie past! It's the 1970s. Society has undergone 100 years of mental, emotional, and spiritual change within just a decade. The 60s challenged outdated custom traditions and ideas. The Hollywood studio system in place for the last 30 to 40 years no longer worked. No one in H-Wood knew what the audience wanted. The once exclusive closed filmmaking doors of Hollywood become open to anyone with talent, vision, and ambition. Portable cameras, a drop in costs of film equipment, and the growing film school culture has Joe Average dreaming of making the next Hollywood hit. With the war in Vietnam and political and civil unrest, Americans see the horrors of humanity reported on TV on a daily basis. Dracula, Frankenstein, and Wolfman no longer seem so scary. A new style of horror begins to emerge, based on the reality around everyone, with more violence, gore, and body count. When daily news reports have body bags of 18-year-old soldiers killed in Vietnam on a daily basis, the close-up of a doorknob turning or a squeaking floorboard don't even make a 10-year-old flinch anymore. In 1971, in Italy, Mario Bava made Twitch of the Death Nerve, and it established new standards for violence and gore in horror films. This would be picked up upon by American horror movie filmmakers. Wes Craven was one of them, and in 1972 he made Last House on the Left, which was less bloody but much more unsettling psychologically by depicting the dehumanization of its victims. One important note here is that Sean Cunningham was the producer of Last House on the Left. 8 years later, he would be the one to direct Friday the 13th. 1974 was a huge year for the emerging slasher slasher genre, which Jason would perfect and define. In October, Texas Chainsaw Massacre picked up on the psychological terror of Last House on the Left, but dropped the gore, leaving the audience to fill in the blanks themselves. What's terrifying about that movie is the mental state of the killers. The family are deranged and insane, and most importantly, Leatherface establishes two key ingredients for the slasher genre: a costume mask trademark and a defining murder weapon. Also, the pattern of victims is starting to be established. All of this can actually go back to Jack the Ripper in terms of a serial murder with an MO, usually prostitutes killed by slashing of their throats. And you can go back to the Agatha Christie novels of the 1900s for the pattern of people gathering in one location only to be killed off one by one. In December of 1974, a little Canadian horror movie named Black Christmas added the first-person camera angle to the grammar of the slasher genre. But you can actually go back to the recently forgotten and under-respected Michael Powell English psychological horror movie Peeping Tom, where the point-of-view camera is used throughout. The killer uses a movie camera to look at his victims as he's killing them. But Peeping Tom, just like Black Christmas, did not include the killer with a unique mask or costume, and as a result failed to become a pop cultural landmark. The next year, Jaws, the movie that started the blockbuster age we currently live in, really became the first unofficial slasher film to put all the pieces together and added one more element: memorable, catchy, creepy music. This is a lesson taken from another 1960 pre-slasher horror psychological thriller classic, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. It had the memorable killer with a costume, Norman Bates dressed as his mother, and his signature weapon, the butcher knife, and the Bernard Herrmann score. Now let's watch the opening to the original Friday the 13th, and pay attention to the soundtrack. You're going to hear elements of Bernard Herrmann's Psycho score and John Williams' Jaws score. And when you look at the first Friday the 13th, its storyline is basically Psycho in reverse. In Psycho, the son is alive and he's killing as if he's the mother. He hears her voice inside of his head. In Friday the 13th, it's the mother killing on behalf of the son. She hears his voice inside her head. Something old has been given an original creative spin and it becomes something new. So not only is Jaws a killing machine, taking out victims one by one, the point of view camera is also used and the music indicates when a murder is about to happen. And Jaws is a shark, a costume you could say, which is a trademark, and the murder weapon would be the razor-sharp teeth. 3 years later, in 1978, Halloween puts this all together. The Jack the Ripper style killer, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre trademark mask and weapon, the body count one by one Agatha Christie style victims, the Peeping Tom Black Christmas point of view camera, and this Psycho Jaws memorable music. But it trades in the gore of Twitch of the Death Nerve and Last House of the Left for the implied terror of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Black Christmas, and adds the final element, which was hinted at in the opening scene of Jaws.
I'm not drunk. Slow down. Wait, I'm coming. I'm coming.
Teenagers breaking from established social mores and morals, most popularly having sex and being punished for it. The 1960s and the early 70s free love movement destroyed this ideal notion of women saving themselves for marriage. And when the youth of society lives sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the old traditional members of that culture feel sort of an unconscious rage, a betrayal beneath the surface, and this simmering anger is picked up by the artist and translated for the audience through the art. Here, Michael Myers becomes the ultimate parental figure, administering punishment for disobeying society's rules. This movie takes a disrespected genre and makes the film world take notice, not only because the story is original, interesting, and engaging, but the filmmaking is brilliant, including a homage to Orson Welles and his long-revered, continuous, unbroken take from the opening of Touch of Evil. But most important for H. Wood and the future of the slasher genre is the profit. Made for just $320,000, it makes $47 million. Numbers like that hadn't been seen since 1972's Deep Throat, which was made for about $50,000 and made a reported $100 million. But that was a theatrical porn release. Halloween was an example of mainstream independent cinema hitting the jackpot, and it became the most profitable independent movie ever made. Most importantly, it launched the slasher genre like a Cape Canaveral space shuttle. As a result, one of the movies to go into production was Sean Cunningham's Friday the 13th. Its budget was around $550,000, and it made about $60 million worldwide. Most importantly, it was the first slasher movie to be distributed by a major studio, Paramount, which couldn't ignore the profits from Halloween and saw the potential in Friday the 13th. Friday took away the masked killer with the trademark weapon and went with the Black Christmas point of view, deciding to use mystery and tension, but also amped up the blood and gore, showing the penetration of weapons instead of implying them, and it focused a lot on the teenage sex and added a twist ending, again borrowing the idea from Psycho, but this time H. Wood was in blockbuster frenzy mode, with Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind taking in crazy amounts of money. The next H. Wood craze would be the sequel. In the past there were plenty of serialized franchises, Charlie Chan, Abbott and Costello, The Thin Man, but here in the 80s, with the blockbuster mentality, sequels became an obsession. If a movie was profitable, a next installment was immediately ordered. Star Wars became the ultimate example of every studio's box office wet dream. Friday the 13th became the first sequelized horror franchise. Even Halloween waited 3 years to make a sequel. Texas Chainsaw Massacre waited 12 years, and even Psycho became a victim of this fad, creating its second installment in 1983, 23 years after the original. Friday the 13th back then was just like Saw is today, a movie every year. In a lot of ways, the slasher genre was created out of some subconscious need in the 70s, some inner emotional unconscious state of humans that needed to be physicalized. But by the mid-80s, it had become commercialized. But you could argue that even from the beginning with Halloween, Texas Chainsaw, and Friday, they were all just exploitation flicks, made for a quick buck. But the best thing, the most important thing about them, was that yes, a lot of these slasher killers were created to grab a piece of the box office slasher pie, but at least they were original, different, creative, and they were trying. Freddy is not Jason, and Chucky and Pinhead are nothing like what we've seen before, or at least a heightened version of something old. You could say Chucky is just a spin on the voodoo-killing doll in the segment titled Amelia from 1975's made-for-ABC TV movie Trilogy of Terror. At least with Chucky, they tried to add something new to the mix. Imagine that the slasher genre was like a formless energy field that started to take shape in the 70s and 80s, and the different faces of this energy became the various slashers. Which makes us wonder today, what is the spirit, that formless, shapeless energy that needs to be translated to the movie screen, that's relevant to today's world? For that answer, we have to return to our time! As the slasher genre burned itself out, it followed the life cycle of all genres. Originality. A groundbreaking movie establishes new movie rules for an old genre or creates a totally new one. Assembly line reproduction. Copycats are spewed out to cash in on the audience's interest in this new and or revitalized genre. Burnout. The genre is sucked dry. All the conventions are used up, all variations are tried, and there's nowhere left to go except parody. Intentional or unintentional, it's time to make fun of all the tired conventions of this genre. It's a way of slapping it in the face and telling it to wake up and reinvent itself. It's at this point that the genre either finds new life and spins itself creatively back into relevancy, or it just fades away. The comedic Freddy of the late 80s and the set-in-space sequels of Leprechaun, Hellraiser, and Jason are all signs that there is literally nowhere left to go with these ideas. Unless Hollywood waits, either for the generation that made them popular to start feeling nostalgic about these movies, or a new generation too young to remember them and repulsed by the out-of-date look of the originals becomes interested enough for remakes, which is where we are today. It's bad enough that the original Friday movies probably should have ended after 2 or 3 installments. After a while, the stories became cliche and the characters two-dimensional, and ultimately, it became an excuse to see how creative the deaths could be. The slasher movie became a porno. You just fast forward through the plot and dialogue just to get to the money shots, the genre set pieces, in this case, the murders and nudity. What makes today's remakes creatively pathetic is that they have no imagination. They don't reinvent or revitalize. They don't have that jolt of inspiration, that lightning bolt of life, that literally brought Jason back to life in Part 6. These movies aren't Frankenstein or Pinocchio. They don't even run under their own power. No, these are like Bernie from Weekend at Bernie's. They're dead, and the filmmakers hold them up, walk them around, and add some strings so they can puppeteer them and make them look alive. The most recent additions to the horror genre that have been original are J-horror and torture porn. The Ring, The Grudge, Saw, and Hostel have added a fresh voice to the horror chorus. And that's great. By now, about 5 years since they were made popular, they too are experiencing the genre life cycle and approaching parody and burnout. The forced logical tension of pale little boys and women with long black hair has made J-horror laughable, and Saw 5 has taken its concept as far as it can go without turning into unintentional comedy. It's time for something new, something inspired, which is another way to say in spirit. What is it about our current times that's scary. What are our fears now? Where are the artists that can feel these fears and translate them into a story that's fun, entertaining, fearful, and commercial so it makes H. Wood happy? I guess nowhere, because this current generation of H. Wood artists listen to the checkbook more than their guts, and as a result there's nothing new. We already had Michael Myers, Jason, and Freddy. Then, if you want to see them in action, watch the originals. They're gonna be the same as the remakes. How different can they make them? Fortunately, we can't answer that, because we can look at the recent remakes and find the secrets of money-motivated horror remakes! Step 1. Make everything feel dirty. The Hitcher, Amityville Horror, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween all feel like the camera is a grimy shower door that hasn't been washed in a year, or as if the camera lens has been dipped in butter and allowed to dry. Step 2. The killer has to move faster. Speed equals improvement. Halloween and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre are great examples of this. And it already seems like Jason's gonna be drinking a little Red Bull. Wow, that's innovation. Why don't we just do that one of his old movies? Here, let's press fast forward. Young, hot, but not naked cast members from CW shows. The Hitcher, Hills Have Eyes, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, When a Stranger Calls. All these movies have really pretty young people who look good on camera and we kind of recognize from TV shows and commercials, but we really don't remember their names. The recent slasher remakes have disrespected the memory of 80s horror movies by not showing any TNA. Wasn't that always one of the great things about seeing a slasher movie back in the day? Before the internet gave you boobies at the click of a button? While it doesn't look like sex is back in this reboot, this remake looks like it's trying to stay true to those slasher roots by including a little skin. Step 4. When all else fails, origin story. Black Christmas, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre The Beginning at least realize that these movies they're remaking or are inspired by, I realize Texas Chainsaw Massacre The Beginning is a prequel to the sequel of the remake, have told their stories first and best, so instead of doing a Gus Van Sant shot-for-shot Psycho remake, they instead expand on the backstory that was only hinted at in the originals. This totally doesn't work, since it's the lack of the exact details about the killer's past that makes them more interesting and terrifying. Isn't it creepier thinking that a normal kid named Michael Myers just one day got filled with evil and rage and went crazy instead of having some white trash family abusive childhood backstory? Step 5. MTV, ADD, editing, and hip soundtracks. Who needs long shots that create tension, gently heightening our tense emotions with eerie scores? All of this is part of the modern day horror formula. It's an equation that has been created based on the box office success of previous horror movies that have used these elements. Whatever happened to the source material dictating the look, sound, and feel of the story instead of trying to make it fit within a predetermined style? Again, a perfect example of original modern day inspired creative horror is Saw. While it owes some inspiration to Kevin Spacey's John Doe character from 1995's Seven, it took the idea to the next level, creating a unique look, style of horror, and mythology. Saw was created by our times. It wasn't even financed by a major studio because it had no track record of box office success. But now, everyone wishes they would have been as smart as Lionsgate. Unfortunately, Friday the 13th Part Remake isn't going to be better than the best movies of the original Friday franchise, because it looks to have forgotten the entire reason we go to see Jason movies, the creativity of the kills. Again, long before Jigsaw was making devices that could Rube Goldberg kill someone, Jason was using old-fashioned tool-shed weapons to carve his victims up. Jason has killed 146 people. Here are a few examples. Now the real challenge is, will Jason top these in this remake? Well, the preview has saved us the trouble of even seeing the movie because it's numbered all the kills. So let's take a look.
You sure you in there? Please, open up! Help! We got the guy killing everybody!
Boring. What's the most creative one here? The boat? Is that Jason driving it? Didn't know he can do that. And what's this? Lame, old, been there, seen that. Wake me up when this doesn't feel like I'm watching the TV censored version of Friday the 13th Part 2. And just in case you had any doubts about the creativity of this remake, here's a look at the new trailer, and here's the old one. Yeah, they're using the same advertising ink. Even back then, the marketers knew the real reason people went to see Jason movies. The same reason we're gonna go now. The body count. Now I know there's been a lot of talk about, yeah, they're gonna explore Jason's backstory or give him more character depth, but what depth? The dude is a killing machine whose face we never see to the end. Why do you want depth in a horror villain? We want to be scared of him. We don't want to understand him. The less we sympathize, the more he terrorizes. Let's ask a few more questions. Did the original Friday movies explore all that could be explored with this idea? The answer? Yes, in every way. They were original, bloody, gory, showed nudity, were creatively violent, had great one-liners, and pioneered the idea of horror franchisers centered around a memorable, marketable main character killer. What more is there left to do? Just one thing. Make more money. It's been 20 years since Jason was truly popular. Part 9 was made in 1993, Part 10 in 2002, and Freddy vs. Jason in 2003. 9 and 10 did okay, but were nowhere near the box office take Jason had in the 80s. Freddy vs. Jason made money because it was a dream matchup that horror fans had been waiting for 25 years. This remake is motivated by a cynical, well, if we don't remake it, someone else will, H-Wood mentality. Now obviously the filmmakers are going to do their best here, but is the studio giving us the cream of the talent crop when it comes to bringing Jason back to life, or are we getting a crew that's just good enough to get the job done? To find out, let's start our examination with the story based on the preview. Some hottie teens borrow their parents' overpriced gas-guzzling SUV, and instead of having a kegger at their home in the burbs while mom and dad are out at the opera, or getting hammered in the corporate skybox suite at the Yankees game, they decide to go off in the woods so the squirrels and beavers can get a look at their, well, beavers and acorns. This sets off a warning sign. Number 4, no-name actors, which probably means bad acting, and warning sign number 26. The actors' names aren't mentioned during the preview, which means they have no drawing power other than warning sign number 43, sex sells, because while their names aren't mentioned, their body parts are. The good stuff starts when hottie number 1, 2, or 3, or in the script it's probably victim 1, 3, or 10, whatever, takes her top off and gives us a little Friday the 13th 80s style TNA. No one has made water skiing this interesting since Fonzie jumped the shark, along with Happy Days the series. That sign of series quality may be applied here too. Here we get our first peek of Jason, then we get warning sign number 19 from the producer of. Here it's Michael Bay, who I think we should create a new warning sign for. Number 59. Michael Bay is involved in the making of this movie. So that's advertised as if it's a good thing. Let's take a look at what movies Michael Bay has produced. Now we all know those movies and they're definitely box office hits, but remember, just because a movie is a box office hit doesn't mean it isn't cinematic. Meanwhile, an Abercrombie & Fitch underwear model is hunting for his lost sister. He asks the locals, including some cliche version of a backwoods grandmother, who gives his creepy yet predictable answer.
Have you seen her?
She ain't missing. She's dead.
The idea for this character is borrowed, or, I'm sorry, in a remake, isn't it called a homage? Right, whatever. From Friday the 13th Part 4. Rob. He's also searching for Jason because he's killed someone he's cared about. Now it's time to plug from the director of, which brings up warning sign number 61. The director's name isn't mentioned, just the vague notion of from the director of. And when they mention the movie, you say, hey, I remember the movie, but I have no clue who directed it. And that usually means he or she is not someone with an overpowering vision that has a unique signature. In this case, it's Marcus Nispel. You probably won't remember him as the director of the Braveheart wannabe Pathfinder, which was on the big screen for like 2 minutes. His major films are Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Pathfinder, and this Friday the 13th remake. He comes from a background of directing music videos, just like Michael Bay. That means they're both experienced with quick editing, half-naked women, and making people stars instead of telling 2-hour stories. But hey, everyone deserves a chance, right? So let's not be too harsh too soon. But why didn't this read from the director of Amy Grant's music video, House of Love? Or at the very least, why didn't this preview tell the truth and say from the director of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the remake? So now we have to issue warning sign number 62. The preview is lying like a crackhead. It's bull. us so it can get us to do what it wants. In this case, cough up our money at the box office. Then the kids start wandering around the woods, then the lights go out, and everybody gives this look. Wow, that's dramatic. Which leads to this scene here. Apparently, Jason has a series of underground tunnels filled with rats and corpses that I guess he's dug out over the years. Maybe this explains how he always gets places faster than everyone else. Or maybe this is the filmmaker's answer to the question, how do we add something new to this remake so it seems a little bit different? There's actually something like this in Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, the original Part 2, not the prequel to the remake. And isn't that some movie bullshit? We can't even say Part 2 without having to ask, wait, do you mean of the original franchise, or a sequel to the remake, or a remake of the original sequel, or the prequel to the sequel remake? This So now Jason is a gopher, and Bill Murray shows up trying to bomb him out. No, wait, sorry, that's a dream I had after watching the trailer a few weeks ago. Now everyone has to start covering their mouths because it's tension time. Shh, he'll hear you, and if he hears you, he'll kill you, and if he kills you, you die, and if you die, then we'll miss this week's episode of Rock of Love Bus. And then we get warning sign number 51. The preview reveals the best parts, especially the kills. Let's take a look at these in order. Wannabe Jonas Brother gets knifed through the floor, which is something we haven't seen before in a Friday film, but maybe we have. Let's go back to part 5 and see what this looks like. Here, a person's hanging from the roof, and somehow they fall on this guy. And pay attention to the weapon he's holding, the poker. Jason's gonna use it later on the policeman. It's scary shadow puppet time. That turns the slumber party into a slaughter party. Here, the policeman gets the poker in the eye, as mentioned earlier. And then this dude's all wrapped up. These teens are holding their breaths, or this guy who looks like Chicken Little from American Idol a few years back. And then here, we get some amazing Shakespeare dialogue. This one has 2 deaths, the person on the car and the girl in the lake, who definitely shouldn't survive that. Here we go back to grimy black and white flashback footage. And what does this look like? The girl with the machete about to chop someone. Seems like this is the scene from the original Friday. Yup, that's Jason's mom right there. And I'm gonna guess this is Abercrombie and Fitch's sister who he's looking for. So that can't count as Jason's 7th victim, but technically it passes for the 7th death depicted in this preview. Here somebody gets an axe to the back, and then there's this. Which seems to be Jason's weakness. He must have been really ignored as a child, because if you just yell out his name, he'll stop whatever he's doing. But there's no addition to the preview body count with this scene. This is a wannabe Saw moment. These blades are getting awfully close to this guy's face, giving him the closest shave of his life. And here we have Jason in the Dawn of the Dead remake fast motion mode here. Here we have random shots of people about to be killed, and it's capped off with a homage of the end of Friday the 13th Part 2. This version is playing it safe, doing what we expect. What's been done before in the past and in the present, so as not to rock the guaranteed box office boat. But since we have nothing to lose right here and now, let's imagine for ourselves what this movie could have been like if this movie had some balls. The first and easiest way to imagine things different is with the writer and director. What if James Cameron, Christopher Nolan, or even the Coen brothers had written and directed this? Yeah, it's not their natural genres, but you can just imagine the originality they would have brought to this. A ballsy move like hiring an A-list director wouldn't have happened because that would have cost more money, and the more money you spend, the less you make. But in our fantasy filmmaking dreams, that's all permissible. However, let's start with the story first. It's been reported that this remake is a combination of story elements from the first 3 to 4 Friday the 13th films. So why don't we do a review of the Friday franchise? Part 1. It's 1958 and 2 horny teens sneak away and are killed by an unknown psychopath. 20 years later, the camp is opening back up. Annie is on her way there when she learns in 1957 a young boy drowned, and then the next year the murder started. Then Annie hitches another ride and is killed. Then everyone else dies, until it's only Alice and Pamela, Jason's mom, facing off. Pamela reveals she's the killer, and that horny, irresponsible teens let her boy drown, and she's gone pretty crazy. Even hearing her son's voice in her head, which is then chopped off by Alice. But later, as she floats in a boat in the middle of the lake, a deformed kid, technically Jason's age, but not really looking like him, around 31, because he was 10 when he drowned over 20 years ago, jumps out and pulls her into the water, which turns out to be only a dream. But not really, because in part 2, Jason, a little bit bigger and stronger, even though it's only 2 months after the first movie, finds Alice and ice picks her in the temple as retribution for decapitating his mom. Here you gotta stop a moment and wonder, if Jason was alive this whole time, that would mean he let his mom think he was dead. And why did he do that? We don't know. The only logical motivation for the sequel was the crazy profit from the first one. So after Jason ice picks Alice, it flashes forward 5 years, making Jason around 36. This guy Paul wants to open a counselor training center near Crystal Lake, and the old dude from the first movie tries to warn him about the danger, but Paul ignores him, and the result is that all these people die. Way to go, Paul. In the end, Paul and a girl named Ginny are the last two alive until Jason, wearing a potato sack, attacks Paul. Ginny runs away in what has to be the longest and maybe the most effective horror movie chase in history. It all culminates in Ginny dressing up like Mrs. Voorhees and faking out Jason with some Jedi mind tricks, until she finally shoulder chops him. All seems well until Jason pops through the window and we get our second look in as many films at his face. It's basically the same surprise ending as the first movie, except this time it really happens. But for some reason, Jason just takes Paul and leaves Ginny. It ends with the ambulance taking her away. Part 3 picks up exactly where Part 2 left off. It even starts using the last couple minutes of the previous installment. Because, remember, back then in 1982, VHS was new and not everyone had a VCR. And of course there was no internet, so unless the movie was on late night TV or cable, there was no way to refresh your memory about what happened. So Jason survives, gets up, and wants a new pair of clothes. Ginny disappears from the story completely, with a new group of fresh meat showing up not at Crystal Lake, but at nearby Higgins Haven, which makes you wonder why Jason is leaving Crystal Lake. Because it's logical the kids wouldn't go there because police have probably sealed it off with the recent murders, but then doesn't Jason only haunt and hunt Crystal Lake? And since Higgins Haven is close to Crystal Lake, wouldn't the kids be kind of nervous about camping so close to a location that just had some murders take place? This is an example of too much thinking. We just want more body count, right? I guess so, because Jason kills all these people and finally becomes an icon by finding his signature mask. He's officially a marketable horror superstar. So the final girl survivor here is named Chris, and there's some goofy backstory about her falling asleep in the woods once and waking up to find someone chasing her. Then she went unconscious and woke up in her bed. And it seems like the mysterious person in the woods with her was Jason, but why would he be nice to her? Wouldn't he just make her another victim? And if he saved her back then, why is he trying to kill her now? Well, whatever, turn off your brains. Jason shows her his face, so she chops him in the head with an axe. Once again, the police and paramedics arrive. Part 4, made in 1984, picks up again exactly where the previous movie left off, in the barn with the ambulance and police. This time we follow Jason to the hospital, where literally the vibrations of lust bring him back to life. This installment is really violent and bloody, probably because it was advertised as the final Friday, and by that time, other wannabe Jason slasher movies had raised the violence and gore to such an extreme level that Jason had to keep up with those trends. So again, everybody dies, including the future George McFly, and it climaxes with another reveal of Jason's ever-deteriorating face. Seriously, what is it made out of? Butter? Jason, dude, stay out of the sun. And just like in Part 2, psychological trickery is used to distract Jason. Here, it's by Tommy, played by Corey Feldman. Yes, that Corey Feldman. He shaves his head so he looks like little boy Jason, and totally f***s him up with a chop to the eye, face, brain, then dices him up just to make sure. It's at this point that Jason is dead. For the first 4 movies, he's been a human. All of his wounds have been survivable and believable. At age 36, he's dead. This is the territory the remake is going to reinvent. It's going to stop with Part 4 because it has to leave the storylines and information in the other sequels open for use because you know there's going to be another sequel to this remake. So then the question is going to be, where do they take Jason from here when this one leaves off? Well, to see the places where the original franchise went, let's take a look at the rest of the films. Part 5, made in 1985, it was a failed experiment of sorts. The end of Part 4 indicates Tommy's going to be crazy, so Part 5 follows Tommy as he's moved from a mental institute to a sort of halfway house. It establishes Tommy as the second most important and reoccurring character in the Friday movies, other than Jason. But too bad here, the real Jason doesn't show up. Instead, it's this ambulance driver who goes crazy after seeing his estranged son's dead body. Tommy keeps having visions of Jason, and this movie actually has some quality psychological thrills. But when it's revealed that the man behind the hockey mask is a man and not Jason, it's like, screw this movie. It ends pretty much the same way as Part 4, in the hospital with Tommy crazy, making us think he's going to become like Jason. Surprisingly, this movie made a good profit. Its budget was $2.2 million and it made $21.3. Not too bad, so Part 6 was ordered up and made the next year. And the filmmakers actually deserve some credit here for continuation of continuity, because at least they tried to connect all the films. At the beginning of Part 5, Tommy is having nightmares that some guys are digging up Jason, and as a result, Jason comes back to life. Well, Part 6 starts with Tommy actually doing it, making it seem as if his dreams were more like a premonition. But now it kinda seems bull, Cause if Jason's been buried under the ground for so long, you would know it's over. He's dead. But Tommy has to get rid of these inner demons, and it seems the best way for him to do that is to dig up Jason's body and cremate him, even though it really makes no sense. So they excavate the corpse. We get our fourth look at Jason's face, which pretty much looks like a dried up beehive. And then this happens. The lightning bolt, sent straight from the Hollywood accounting office, brings him back to life. Now it's cheesy in a Frankenstein-y kind of way, but it creates an energized, badass killing machine. While the series officially goes over the top at this point, it gets a whole lot more fun. The sequel has the most creative kills up to this point, and it sets the standard for the rest of the films to come. But it's also a sign that the slasher genre is moving towards the end of its life cycle. It's on the verge of parodying itself. So all these people die, and it ends with Tommy reading some occult book telling him to return Jason's restless soul to the place where the evil started, the bottom of Crystal Lake. After a pretty cool final sequence and a propeller blade to the face, Jason is put to rest. Or not, because this movie only cost $3 million to make, and it made 20, so it's time for another sequel. And this shot here makes no sense, because isn't Jason a superpowered zombie now? Couldn't he just break the chain and free himself? Or are the occult laws of being returned to the bottom of Crystal Lake holding him there? We're thinking too much again. So 2 years later, in 1988, Part 7 is released. And now, it's really getting crazy. Jason, who had his eye open at the end of Part 6, has apparently fallen asleep, and is reawakened by a girl with telekinetic powers. Yes, psychic ESP mind powers have been introduced. Tommy as a character is gone from the series, so the focus now is on Tina Shepard. After having a bad session with her sleazy psychologist, she goes to the lake where years earlier she was responsible for killing her abusive dad. She tries to bring him back to life, but instead wakes up Jason and then passes out. And here you have to wonder again, why doesn't Jason kill her? It's just like in Part 3, when the girl described falling asleep in the woods, and Jason returned her to her room. Why doesn't he do anything to these girls? Do they have to have sex before he's allowed to take revenge? Whatever. Again, too much thinking. Some more victims show up for Jason, everyone dies, until it's just the girl and her boyfriend. But this time, Jason's up against some crazy powers. I have to admit though, even though this movie's pretty ridiculous, I really love it. I saw it in the theaters, and at the time I was really into horror films. And seeing this on the big screen, it was just a really fun time. It was something new, Jason had some creative kills, and we the audience actually got to see someone who could actually match up against Jason. We also got to see his face for the 5th time. By now it looks like a piece of cow with teeth and a pirate eye patch. And this movie ends the same way Part 6 did, with Jason at the bottom of Crystal Lake, this time pulled down by Tina's father. Part 7 cost only $3.5 million and made another 20, so no doubt it would be time for Part 8, which happened the next year in 1989. It's at this point you have to ask as a filmmaker, okay, we just had Jason fight a with mind powers. Where can we go next? Well, how about a truly genius move? Taking Jason to Manhattan. That's awesome. This was probably the most easily marketable Friday out of all of them. And it's something that all Friday fans had wondered for a long time. What if Jason was taken out of the woods and put in modern day civilization? What if he had to deal with gangs, police, and all the other elements of life? At this point in the franchise, there's really only 3 interesting parts to every installment. First, how is Jason going to be brought back to life? Second, how creative will his kills be? And third, how is he going to die? Here, he's brought back by an electric shock from a power line. Yeah, that's gotta be the lamest one out of all of them. What's worse is that Jason doesn't even look like he did in Part 7. At least up to Part 7, the filmmakers had the continuity not only of story, but of Jason's look. Here, the clothes are pretty much brand new. His mask broke at the end of Part 7, so you can understand that he doesn't have that, and he gets a new one. But worst of all, when you see his face at the end of the movie, it looks nothing like it did at Part 7. What the f***? But the worst thing about Jason Takes Manhattan is that Jason is in Manhattan for like 20 minutes. Yeah, this should have been subtitled Jason on a boat for 70 minutes. This has to be the worst case of false advertising ever. And all the kills except one are so tired and unoriginal. But guess what? Once he gets to Manhattan, things get fun, which has maybe the best joke of the series here.
You a dead meat slime bag. Yo, man, it's cool. It's cool, man. It's cool.
And one of the best kills.
Take your best shot.
But then, for some reason, the final 10 minutes are all underground, in the sewer system. And how does Jason die? With toxic waste. This movie is dog. As if things weren't strange enough, there's another backstory with a girl who went to Crystal Lake when she was young and she met Jason underwater and he didn't kill her, and for some reason he's appearing to her in visions now. What does this mean? Nothing. It's never explained. And oh yeah, the toxic waste changes Jason into a little kid. What is this movie doing? This movie was more expensive to make than the previous ones with a budget of $5 million, and it only took in 14.3, probably due to the bad word of mouth, even though the advertising hype and marketing were pretty great. I mean, Jason even made a talk show appearance.
Starting today, you can see him in Friday the 13th, Part 8. Jason Takes Manhattan. Please welcome Jason.
By the end of the 80s, the slasher genre was nearing the finish line. Jason, Freddy, and Michael Myers would all slowly fade away over the next few years, and it wasn't until 1993, 4 years later, a record for the Jason series in terms of time between sequels, that Jason returned. Here, the filmmakers just figured, let's forget all the sequel logic. This movie didn't bother to explain how Jason went from a kid at the end of Part 8 to a full-grown adult killing machine once again at the beginning of Part 9. Instead, it just starts in Crystal Lake and Jason's back to his old tricks. But the filmmakers do deserve a little bit of credit, because they raised the bar, having Jason face off against the FBI right away, and his blown up. Cool, great, but what happens now? Here it gets kinda cheesy. First, the movie pretty much rips off the classic 1987 sci-fi horror movie The Hidden, where an alien moves from host to host in order to stay alive. Here, all of a sudden, the spirit of Jason turns into an overgrown tequila worm. This is what happens when the thrills of kills get tired. You have to create a mythology, a bigger story to make things seem fresh. So now we learn Jason is pure evil, and he needs to find a Voorhees blood relative to be reborn into Jason form. Oh man, whatever. So we have to put up with different people playing Jason, only getting glimpses of him in mirrors, which makes no sense, but whatever. This movie does deserve credit for having the most creative kills of any of the installments. There are definitely a lot of cringe-worthy moments. I saw this in the theater, and it was a pretty good time. There was a lot of cheering. The end, though, is pretty lame. Jason finds a Voorhees body, is reborn, and then is sent to hell using some sacred dagger. And in the biggest marketing movie ploy ever, Freddy's glove pops out of the ground, taking Jason's mask to hell. Whatever that means, cause isn't Freddy alive only in the dream world? Who knows? The most interesting part of this installment is the dagger. It's basically the same one used in the Evil Dead movies. And in a scene in Jason's mom's house, there's a shot of the Necronomicon. That's pretty cool, and it makes you wonder about Jason's mom and how he was able to survive the drowning. More on that in just a minute. If you listen to the commentary of this movie, the filmmakers say they just put the book in there for shits and giggles, because they visited Sam Raimi on the set of Evil Dead 3, and he let them use the book for that shot. Well, so much for a master plan storyline mythology, I guess. Next, Jason X, aka Friday the 13th Part 10, was made in 2001, 8 years later. I love how it's just called Jason X, not Friday the 13th Part 10. I guess it's just the filmmaker saying, look, we know the dude's name is Jason, and everyone calls these Jason movies, so let's just name it the way everyone says it. Now, it was made because Freddy vs. Jason had been delayed so many times that everyone thought there was a hunger for another Jason installment. Big mistake. It cost $13 million, a crazy amount for a Jason movie, but only made $12.6. So it looked like the audience really didn't care to see another Jason movie. But then again, the filmmakers didn't give themselves much of a chance. It's set in space. Everyone knows that's where horror franchises go to die. Space is where you go when there are no more ideas. But on Jason X's commentary, the filmmakers say they went there because they wanted to incorporate future technology into Jason kills, which really doesn't happen. The coolest kill is this T-1000 Terminator 2 wannabe liquid nitrogen moment. Other than that, it's all the same. The movie doesn't explain anything about Jason coming back from hell, or being changed back from a kid to an adult, or how he made out of Crystal Lake. It just has Jason alive, and the same stuff happens. Everyone dies, and it's boring until Jason becomes what is now known as Uber Jason. Yeah, nanotechnology makes him into a super killer. Now the movie gets fun for about 10 minutes. Because just like Friday the 13th Part 8, the original creative fun stuff happens at the end of the movie, and then it's over. Jason's burned up in the atmosphere, and the mask falls to the bottom of the lake. But Jason X does have what might be the greatest dialogue in Friday the 13th history.
Hey, you want a beer?
Or do you want to smoke some pot?
Or we can have premarital sex.
And so that's the end of Jason, a history of a dying idea left on life support just so it can collect some extra cash. This idea, if honestly explored, could probably last for 2 movies, without gimmicks and bull twists and turns. But when an idea makes a lot of money, it's forced to live longer than it should. It's like a rotting banana. As long as you keep painting the outside yellow, it looks fresh, but once you bite in to taste it, it's rotten as shit. So let's explore a story for our no bull version. First, it has to be created with no sequel in mind. Tell a complete story with a solid ending. That way you're using all your good ideas right away. You're not holding anything back. So let's say we're going to learn from the successes and mistakes of the entire franchise, take all the best parts and put them together. We should consider the original 10 movies rough drafts, explorations of a concept, and the different places it could go. Now it's time to make it into an interesting story. The story starts the same way. Jason's mom is a cook at a camp, and her son is deformed. She tries to help him adjust to life by having him interact with the other kids, but as we know, kids can be the cruelest creatures of all. He's bullied, made fun of, and ultimately thrown in the lake as a joke, but he drowns as all the kids just sit there and watch. Jason's mom goes crazy. She has no husband or family. He was her life. She's probably really religious. She's turned to some extreme cultist religion after having Jason and seeing him deformed. See, she had premarital sex as a teen, got pregnant, and the guy left her. Then, after Jason was born and she saw that he was deformed, she believed that God punished her for her sins and gave her a deformed baby. This is her cross to bear. So believing in God and the goodness of people, she brings Jason to this camp. As the police and paramedics shut down Crystal Lake and take Jason's lifeless body to the morgue, Pamela Voorhees goes totally insane. Later that night, she steals his body and brings him home. She's about to kill herself to be with Jason when there's a knock on the door. It's someone from her cultist church. Let's call him the Stranger. He's heard of Jason's death, and he tells her that he can bring her son back to her. He pulls out the Necronomicon and the dagger, the same one used in Evil Dead and in Jason Goes to Hell. He wants to rid the world of sin and wants to create a sort of Grim Reaper of morals that obeys his religious morality. He calls it the World Cleanser or the Sin Cleaner or something like that. He's going to give Pamela back her son and make him the vengeful hand of God. To do this, he casts a spell that can only work if Pamela takes the dagger and kills the counselors who were sinning when Jason drowned. Desperate to get her son back and believing it's God's work, she does just that. Jason comes back to life but is different. The Stranger tells her the only way Jason could stay alive is that if he kills sinners. He sort of feeds off their souls. Or maybe Jason's not alive if there's no sin going on. He's like a mummy just waiting for action. Then once he senses evil is going on, moral evil, he wakes up and is driven to kill. Or maybe Jason seems fine, and his mom doesn't believe that he's cursed to kill. He's alive, and that's good enough for her, but one day she wakes up and Jason is holding a decapitated head. She freaks out. This isn't her son. She calls the Stranger to find out what happened, and he tells her that only the dagger can kill Jason. That her son is gone, but in his place is God's weapon of judgment. He talks about all the plans he has for Jason. In a rage of depression and disappointment, realizing that he lied to her, or that she misunderstood him, she kills the Stranger with the dagger. Then she locks Jason up. Determined to have her son back, she vows to make the world a good place so that her son never has to kill. So that's the setup for Jason. Now, if the movie really has some balls, it would create three-dimensional characters of the soon-to-be victims. The question needs to be asked, what can they add to this setup? If Jason was born of sin, killed in sin, reborn by sin, and is the punisher of sin, then why not stay with this theme? I'd love to see like a Bible camp group come visit Crystal Lake. They'd be safest, right? They're not going to sin. Everything would be fine. But of course, people are people, and everyone is tempted to violate their rules. The main character, of course, should be a girl, and she's a hottie, but she's trying to be virtuous. She's saving herself for marriage, doesn't drink or do any of that stuff. And while all the students seem like angels to their teachers and counselors, behind the scenes it's all drug and sex. They're just there to make their parents happy. They talk about how these ideas of being a virgin and no drug are all outdated and lame. And then they let loose. Once that starts happening, Jason shows up. But is he evil or just the judgment of God that's being preached to these kids? Maybe Jason's mom is the leader and she's trying to make the world a sin-free place. For this hot girl under all this pressure to be normal and give it up, Jason seems like God's punishment. She's also the girl Pamela Voorhees wishes she could have been when she was her age. Yes, in this version, Pamela is alive to the end, because after all, it's her sins that created Jason, so the story between Mother, Jason, and this new virginal girl all tie in together. You're probably saying, dude, that's way too deep and unnecessary for a slasher movie. I just want to see some creative kills, eat some popcorn, and I'm done. I definitely hear you, and when I was 14, 15, 16, 17, I couldn't have agreed more. But haven't you already seen all that? Don't you want something new? And if done right, these religious themes wouldn't get in the way of the kill and the fun of a slasher movie. It's like a Rorschach test. You see what you want to see. If you're interested in the kills, then that would be your focus. Go back and watch it 10 years from now, and you might pick up on the other levels. I would just like to see these other levels put in. And of course, each kill would have to be unique and better than what's come before. No simple knifing or axing or none of that. But don't make it Rube Goldberg's Saw complex. Find a nice middle ground where it's creative but true to Jason's character. Remember, if you want to have an impact on an audience, they have to know why the killing is happening and not just how it's happening. Essentially, all the Friday films are based on this idea that Jason punishes teens for their sins, so why not really just go for it? My dream director would be Peter Jackson. Yeah, Lord of the Rings Peter Jackson. Now you might or you might not know that he started in horror movies. Check out Bad Taste, it's a total classic. And if you haven't seen Dead Alive, you are missing out on one of the great horror, comedy, zombie, gore movies ever. Which, by the way, has this whole Oedipus complex mother-son dynamic going on. So it's funny, fun, bloody, and deep. Peter Jackson could probably be the writer on this too. It's so easy to slap together a slasher script. Get a killer with a gimmick, plus a death every 5 minutes, the end, cha-ching. It's easy to write victims. It takes skill to write characters. Now if Peter Jackson didn't write this, how about David Cronenberg? He has a huge background in horror films, and his movies are pretty deep. So that's where Peter Jackson's direction could make things livelier, but Cronenberg could make things darker and more complex. Or go for another David Lynch. Just say that out loud. Friday the 13th, directed by Peter Jackson, or Friday the 13th, directed by David Lynch, or David Cronenberg. Doesn't it already feel different, better, instead of Friday the 13th, written and directed by the dudes who brought you the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake? When quality talent is attached to a project, you feel better about it, and you expect more. Now let's talk about actors. It'd be great to see Reese Witherspoon playing the virginal main character, but she's probably a little bit too old now to pull off a 17-year-old, so how about Megan Fox? Scarlett Johansson might be able to do it, Anne Hathaway and Amy Adams could play counselors who on the surface seem like saints, but below are definitely sinners. It's all about creating characters with real issues and letting them play out in this setting. Jason is the Grim Reaper and the judger of evil. In the end, Jason and his mother would die, maybe with Pamela getting decapitated by someone to keep the homage to the first movie going, and with Jason using the Necronomicon dagger on himself, because the virginal girl was somehow able to reach inside of Jason and contact the child within, and it's that child that destroys the evil that he's become. Also, the second half of the movie would take place in Manhattan. We have to make up for the disappointment of Friday the 13th Part 8. So the first half of this movie takes place at Crystal Lake with the Bible camp, and Jason then follows them into the city where there's a ton of evil, and he just goes crazy. And at that point, Pamela's still alive, and she sees that her son is just this unstoppable killing machine, and she's the one that brings the dagger and gives it to the girl, so that she can try to use it on Jason. Something like that. And the virgin would be left alive to tell the story. But that's wishful thinking. We are where we are, and we have what we have, and it's basically the same as what we've gotten before. For Friday the 13th Part Remake, expect a sequel in the next year or two, and other horror movie franchises to continue to be remade. And it seems Jason, no matter how hard he tries, will never, ever die. The Movie Preview Critic rates Friday the 13th Part Remake unworthy of big screen viewing. See it as a rental, cause it's the same old shit. You know what you're getting. It's an unnecessary remake. It's done only for the easy payday. It has no balls, but if you're a fan of horror icons and slasher movies, this will do the job for you. It's definitely a sign of the moviepocalypse. But, I know, it's Valentine's Day weekend, you've got your date, or you're hanging out with your bros, you're young, and you probably haven't seen a Friday the 13th movie in theaters before, so here's my I give up rating, because there's nothing I can do to stop you from seeing this. Even though it's unworthy unworthy. If you're gonna go see it, you should see it at regular price. The only way to watch a horror movie is in a packed theater. It's also a great time for the popcorn trick, and it'll make a good bromance movie. Now it's time for Friday the 13th Part Remake's place in movie history. It should be better than all the recent horror remakes like My Bloody Valentine, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Hills Have Eyes, as well as Friday the 13th Part 3, 5, 8, and 10, but won't be better than Parts 1, 2, 4, 7, or 9. And that's Friday the 13th Part Remake's place in movie history. Whenever a movie is unworthy, it's time for you to see this instead. If you're in the mood for a Jason movie, check out Friday the 13th Part 2, which has one of the best, most tense movie chase sequences in a horror movie ever. Part 4, which is great for the quality of the kills and the overall story mythology. Part 6, which shoots Jason up with steroids and unleashes a killing machine. And Part 7, especially the last 20 minutes, which is a great final battle between Jason and the telekinetic girl. And now it's time for Friday the 13th's contribution to cinema. It's a negative one. It's yet another example of H. Wood continuing to defile older, better movies for the sake of quick profit. It misses a chance to use the horror genre to include metaphor and social commentary. It continues to make audiences cynical as to the future of quality movies. And it doesn't add or improve on the original it's remaking. Finally, wondering how much money this movie's gonna make? Let's ask the box office psychic. Since these preview reviews come out early, it's time to see if we can predict the box office numbers. It's Valentine's Day weekend, and a remake of a popular horror icon with no real box office competition should bring it some big-time money, let's say between 25 and 35 million. Look for it to stay in theaters for about 6 to 8 weeks, which will bring its total to around 70 million. With a budget of 16, that should be enough for a sequel to be greenlit immediately after this weekend. And with that, consider yourselves advised, choose your movies wisely, and as always,